In the winter of 1987, Operation Glacier Crown was supposed to be a routine high-altitude reconnaissance mission in the remote regions of the Pakistani Himalayas. What began as standard intelligence gathering along disputed border territories would become one of the most classified encounters in modern military history. The following account draws from declassified mission reports, personal testimonies from surviving operators, and intelligence documents that remained buried for over 3 decades. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, known as the Nightstalkers, had built their reputation on impossible missions in impossible places. From the deserts of the Middle East to the jungles of Central America, these elite aviators specialized in inserting and extracting special operations forces under the most challenging conditions imaginable. But nothing in their training had prepared them for what they would encounter in the thin air and perpetual twilight of the world's highest mountain range. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen had been flying with the Nightstalkers for 6 years when he received orders for what the briefing classified as Priority Alpha Reconnaissance Operation. The 28-year-old crew chief from Oregon had participated in dozens of classified missions, but this one felt different from the moment he walked into the secure briefing room at Bagram Airfield. The atmosphere was tense in a way that suggested the mission planners themselves weren't entirely sure what they were sending his team into. The briefing officer, a colonel whose name remains redacted in all official documents, provided the basic parameters. Intelligence indicated unusual activity in a remote valley system, approximately 200 kilometers northeast of Islamabad, in territory that officially belonged to Pakistan, but remained largely ungoverned and unexplored. Satellite imagery had detected structures that didn't match known geological formations, along with heat signatures that suggested organized human presence in an area where no settlements were supposed to exist. What made the mission particularly challenging was the altitude. The target area sat at nearly 15,000 feet above sea level, pushing the operational limits of their modified Black Hawk helicopters. The thin air would affect everything from engine performance to crew endurance, and the weather patterns in the region were notoriously unpredictable. Winter storms could appear without warning, creating whiteout conditions that had claimed the lives of experienced mountaineers and military personnel alike. Chief Warrant Officer Rebecca Santos, the mission's pilot in command, had more high-altitude experience than anyone else in the unit. The 34-year-old from Colorado had grown up in the Rocky Mountains and understood how quickly conditions could deteriorate at extreme elevations. During the pre-mission planning, she emphasized the narrow operational window they would have. Fuel consumption increased dramatically at high altitude, and the helicopter's performance envelope would be severely restricted. They would have perhaps 90 minutes on station before they needed to begin their return flight, and that was assuming optimal conditions. The team's loadout reflected the challenging environment they would be entering. Each crew member carried specialized cold weather gear rated for temperatures that could drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Their standard night vision equipment was supplemented with thermal imaging systems designed to penetrate the snow and ice that covered the target area year-round. Emergency survival equipment included mountaineering gear, high-altitude medical supplies, and enough food and water to sustain the crew for 72 hours in case of emergency landing or extraction delays. The mission's intelligence component was handled by Technical Sergeant David Park, a signals intelligence specialist who had been monitoring electronic communications in the region for several months. Park's preliminary analysis had identified radio transmissions using encryption methods that didn't match any known military or civilian systems. More disturbing were the voice communications his equipment had intercepted. The languages being spoken weren't Urdu, Pashto, or any of the other regional dialects his training had covered. Some of the recordings featured vocalizations that didn't sound entirely human. Park's findings had initially been dismissed as equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference. High-altitude environments were known to create unusual radio propagation effects, and the extreme cold could cause electronic equipment to behave unpredictably. But when multiple listening posts began reporting similar anomalies, and when the transmissions showed clear patterns of organized communication, military intelligence decided that direct reconnaissance was warranted. The operation launched at 0300 hours on February 15, 1987, under conditions that meteorology classified as marginal but acceptable. Cloud cover was scattered at 12,000 feet, with winds gusting to 35 knots at the target elevation. Temperature at the departure point was minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit and was expected to drop significantly as they gained altitude. The crew had calculated their fuel margins down to the minute, knowing that any delays or course deviations could leave them without sufficient reserves for the return journey. As their modified Black Hawk climbed toward the target area, the landscape below transformed from the familiar brown and green of the Pakistani lowlands to the stark white and grey of the high Himalayas. The mountains here weren't the gentle slopes that recreational skiers might recognize. These were vertical walls of rock and ice that stretched upward until they disappeared into clouds and mist. The valleys between peaks were so deep and narrow that they remained in perpetual shadow, creating a landscape that seemed more alien than terrestrial. Santos noted the first anomaly approximately 45 minutes into the flight. Their GPS navigation system, which had been functioning normally throughout the ascent, began displaying erratic readings as they approached the target coordinates. The satellite fix would jump by several kilometers without warning, then settle back to what appeared to be the correct position before jumping again. This type of interference was virtually unknown at the time, as GPS technology was still relatively new, and its vulnerabilities weren't fully understood. More concerning was the behavior of their radio equipment. Communication with their base station became increasingly difficult as they gained altitude, but not in the predictable pattern that high-altitude operations typically produced. Instead of a gradual degradation in signal strength, they experienced sudden periods of complete silence, followed by bursts of crystal-clear transmission. During one of these clear periods, Park's monitoring equipment detected the same unusual transmissions his ground-based systems had been tracking, but now they were coming from multiple directions and seemed much closer than the target coordinates indicated. Chen, monitoring the aircraft systems from his position at the crew chief station, reported that their radar was painting contacts that didn't correlate with the known topography of the area. The returns suggested large objects moving through the valleys below them, but when he switched to visual observation through his night vision equipment, he could see nothing that would account for the radar signatures. The objects appeared to be maintaining formation and moving at speeds that would be impossible for ground vehicles in that terrain. As they approached the primary target area, the crew began to understand why this particular valley system had attracted intelligence attention. Even through the swirling snow and ice crystals that limited visibility to a few hundred meters, it was clear that the landscape below them had been modified by intelligent design. What satellite imagery had interpreted as unusual geological formations were actually structures built from massive stones that had been quarried and positioned with precision that suggested advanced engineering capabilities. The structures weren't random. They formed a complex pattern that extended for several kilometers along the valley floor, connected by what appeared to be carefully constructed pathways that remained clear of snow despite the harsh conditions. Most intriguingly, thermal imaging revealed that these structures were generating significant heat signatures, indicating active habitation or industrial processes that required substantial energy sources. In an environment where temperatures rarely rose above freezing even in summer, the presence of such heat sources suggested technology or resources that weren't available to the nomadic populations that occasionally passed through these remote areas. Santos brought the helicopter into a slow orbit around the perimeter of the structure complex, maintaining sufficient altitude to avoid any potential ground-based threats while allowing the crew to conduct detailed reconnaissance. What they observed challenged their understanding of what was possible in such an isolated and inhospitable environment. the construction showed evidence of both ancient and modern techniques, with massive stone foundations supporting more recent additions that incorporated materials and designs that didn't match any regional architectural traditions. Park's signals intelligence equipment was now detecting multiple transmission sources within the complex, using a variety of communication methods that ranged from conventional radio frequencies to exotic transmission modes that his equipment could detect but not decode. The volume of communication suggested a population significantly larger than the visible structures should have been able to support, leading to speculation that much of the complex extended underground into the mountain itself. It was during their third orbit that Chen made the observation that would transform their routine reconnaissance mission into something that defied conventional explanation. Through his thermal imaging system, he detected a heat signature moving across the snow-covered slope above the main structure complex. The signature was large, much larger than any known animal in the region, and it was moving upright on two legs with a gait that suggested both intelligence and purpose. The creature, for lack of a better term, appeared to be approximately 9 feet tall and covered in what looked like thick fur or hair that provided effective insulation against the extreme cold. Its movement pattern showed none of the awkwardness that humans displayed at high altitude. Instead, it moved with the fluid confidence of something perfectly adapted to its environment. As Chen adjusted his equipment for a clearer view, the creature seemed to become aware of their presence and looked directly up at their aircraft. What Chen saw in that moment would haunt him for the remainder of his military career and beyond. The face that looked up at their helicopter was unmistakably humanoid, but with features that suggested an evolutionary path that had diverged from modern humans thousands of years ago. The eyes reflected their thermal imaging beam with an intelligence that was clearly aware and analytical. This wasn't a primitive creature reacting on instinct. It was something that understood exactly what their helicopter represented and was making calculated decisions about how to respond. The creature raised one massive arm and gestured toward their aircraft in what could only be interpreted as a deliberate communication attempt. Then, moving with surprising speed for something of its size, it began descending toward the structure complex below. Within moments, other similar heat signatures began appearing throughout the thermal imaging display. The crew realized they weren't observing a single anomalous creature, but rather a coordinated community of beings that had been monitoring their approach and were now responding to the presence of the military aircraft. Santos made the tactical decision to extend their orbit and climb to a higher altitude while the crew attempted to process what they were observing. The fuel calculations that had seemed manageable at the beginning of the mission were now becoming critical, but the intelligence value of their observations seemed to justify the risk of pushing their operational envelope. They were documenting the existence of something that official military doctrine insisted was impossible, and the implications for regional security and scientific understanding were staggering. As they maintained their elevated observation position, the crew watched as the heat signatures below them began moving in patterns that suggested organized activity. Lights that hadn't been visible during their initial approach began appearing throughout the structure complex, and their radio equipment started detecting new types of transmissions that seemed to be coordinated responses to their presence. Whatever they had discovered in this remote Himalayan valley was not only aware of modern technology, but appeared to be using sophisticated communication and organizational systems that rivaled anything in the conventional military's arsenal. The encounter that followed would challenge everything these elite military operators thought they knew about the world they were sworn to protect, and the choices they made in the next few minutes would echo through decades of classified reports and whispered conversations among those with the highest security clearances. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly when Park's monitoring equipment detected what could only be described as a coordinated electronic warfare response from the valley below. The sophisticated communication systems that had initially intrigued intelligence analysts were now actively jamming their navigation equipment and disrupting their radio communications with increasing precision. This wasn't random interference or atmospheric distortion. Someone or something was deliberately targeting their aircraft's electronic systems with methods that suggested an understanding of modern military technology that shouldn't have existed in this remote corner of the world. Santos felt the helicopter's flight controls begin to respond sluggishly as they climbed to what should have been a safe observation altitude. The thin air at 16,000 feet was already pushing their aircraft to its operational limits, but now they were experiencing power fluctuations that couldn't be attributed to altitude alone. The engine temperature gauges were climbing toward redline levels despite the sub-zero ambient conditions, and the rotor system was producing harmonic vibrations that indicated stress loads beyond normal parameters. What made the situation truly alarming was the systematic nature of the interference they were experiencing. Rather than the random degradation of equipment performance that high-altitude operations typically produced, their systems were failing in a sequence that suggested someone with intimate knowledge of Black Hawk vulnerabilities was targeting their most critical components in order of importance. First the GPS navigation, then the primary radio systems, followed by the flight management computers that controlled engine performance and rotor blade angle. Chen reported that his thermal imaging system was now detecting heat signatures moving with impossible speed across the mountainous terrain surrounding their position. The creatures he had initially observed near the structure complex were now spread across several square kilometers of mountain slopes, maintaining what appeared to be coordinated observation posts that provided overlapping coverage of the entire valley system. Their movement patterns showed tactical awareness that suggested military training or evolutionary adaptation to warfare in high-altitude environments. More disturbing was the realization that these beings were not simply reacting to the helicopter's presence, but had been tracking their approach long before they arrived at the target coordinates. Park's analysis of the radio transmissions he had recorded showed that the communication patterns had changed approximately 2 hours before their aircraft had even departed from Bagram Airfield. Something in this remote valley had advanced knowledge of their mission and had been preparing countermeasures since before the Nightstalkers had received their briefing. The crew's training emphasized maintaining situational awareness and tactical flexibility, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for an adversary that combined primitive appearance with sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities. The beings they were observing moved through terrain that would challenge experienced mountaineers, yet they appeared to be using communication systems that could disrupt military-grade equipment from distances that should have been impossible, given the known limitations of portable transmission devices. Santos made the decision to begin their extraction while they still had sufficient engine power to maintain controlled flight. The fuel calculations that had seemed adequate during mission planning were now complicated by the increased power requirements needed to overcome whatever interference was affecting their aircraft systems. Every minute they remained in the area reduced their safety margins and increased the probability that they would be forced to make an emergency landing in terrain, where survival would be measured in hours rather than days. As they began their descent toward the valley exit, the crew experienced what Park later described as the most sophisticated display of electronic warfare he had encountered during his military career. Their radio communications were not simply jammed, but were replaced by transmissions that mimicked their own voices, and call signs with accuracy that suggested real-time voice analysis and reproduction capabilities. The false transmissions provided contradictory navigation instructions and emergency procedures that could have led them into controlled flight into terrain if they hadn't recognized the deception. The helicopter's radar system began painting multiple contacts that appeared to be aircraft-sized objects moving at speeds and altitudes that defied known aerodynamic principles. The contacts would appear at their flight level, maintain formation with their aircraft for several seconds, then accelerate vertically at rates that would have been lethal to human occupants. When Chen attempted to observe these contacts through his night vision equipment, he could see nothing that corresponded to the radar returns, leading to speculation that they were observing some form of stealth technology or atmospheric phenomenon that their equipment couldn't properly interpret. What transformed their tactical withdrawal into something approaching terror was the moment when Santos realized that their pursuers were not simply monitoring their departure, but were actively herding them towards specific geographic coordinates. Every time she attempted to navigate toward what appeared to be the safest exit route from the valley system, their electronic systems would experience targeted interference that forced course corrections toward increasingly dangerous terrain. The beings below them had apparently studied their aircraft's performance limitations and were using that knowledge to force them into flight profiles that pushed their helicopter beyond its operational envelope. They were being guided toward areas where the combination of altitude, weather conditions, and terrain features would make controlled flight increasingly difficult, while simultaneously being cut off from communication with their base station and any potential rescue assets. Chen's thermal imaging system revealed that the creatures were now moving in a complex pattern that suggested they were attempting to drive the helicopter toward a specific location deeper in the mountain range. Heat signatures were appearing on ridgelines and peaks that formed a corridor leading away from their planned extraction route and toward terrain that their maps showed as unexplored and potentially impassable for aircraft operations. The psychological pressure of being hunted by an adversary that combined primitive appearance with advanced tactical capabilities began to affect the crew's decision-making processes. Park found himself questioning the reliability of his own equipment and wondering whether the electronic signatures he was detecting were real or the product of some form of psychological warfare designed to induce confusion and panic. The boundary between technical malfunction and deliberate interference became increasingly difficult to determine as their situation continued to deteriorate. Santos recognized that they were approaching what military doctrine classified as a tactical decision point, where continued mission execution would compromise crew survival. The fuel remaining in their tanks was now insufficient to guarantee their return to base even under optimal conditions, and the interference affecting their navigation systems made accurate course plotting virtually impossible. Yet abandoning their position would mean losing the most significant intelligence discovery in recent military history and potentially leaving these beings free to continue whatever activities had drawn official attention to this remote valley. The crew's dilemma was complicated by the realization that their standard emergency procedures were being systematically countered by an adversary that appeared to understand their tactical doctrine better than they understood their enemy's capabilities. Emergency landing sites that should have provided safe havens were being revealed as tactical traps where the terrain would prevent takeoff even if they managed to survive the initial touchdown. Radio frequencies reserved for emergency communications were being jammed with the same precision that had disrupted their primary systems. As their helicopter struggled to maintain altitude in the thin air and worsening weather conditions, Chen made an observation that would fundamentally change their understanding of what they were facing in the Himalayan wilderness. Through his thermal imaging system, he detected a heat signature unlike anything they had observed during their reconnaissance mission. This signature was enormous, easily 3 times the size of the humanoid creatures they had been tracking, and it was moving toward their position with speed that defied the difficult terrain. The massive being appeared to be coordinating the movements of the smaller creatures through some form of communication that Park's equipment could detect but not decode. The transmission patterns suggested a hierarchical command structure, with the large entity serving as some form of field commander directing tactical operations against their aircraft. This wasn't a chance encounter with unknown wildlife. It was a planned military operation executed by beings with intelligence, organization, and technology that challenged fundamental assumptions about what was possible in the modern world. Santos felt the helicopter's control responses become increasingly sluggish as the massive creature approached their position. The interference affecting their electronic systems intensified to the point where she was flying primarily on manual controls with minimal instrument guidance. The engine temperature warnings that had been intermittent were now constant, and she could feel vibrations through the airframe that indicated mechanical stress approaching the aircraft's structural limits. The weather conditions that had been marginal at the beginning of their mission were now deteriorating rapidly as wind speeds increased and visibility dropped to near zero levels. What had started as scattered snow flurries was developing into a full mountain storm system that would make navigation impossible, even with fully functional equipment. They were being forced to choose between immediate extraction under dangerous conditions or emergency landing in hostile territory with an unknown adversary that had demonstrated both the capability and intention to prevent their escape. The decision came down to seconds rather than minutes. Santos could feel the Black Hawk losing power as the massive heat signature continued its approach toward their position. Through the swirling snow that now limited visibility to less than 50 meters, Chen's thermal imaging revealed that the enormous creature was moving upright across terrain that should have been impossible to navigate, even for experienced mountaineers with proper equipment. Its size suggested something that stood nearly 15 feet tall, yet it moved with the fluid precision of a predator that had evolved specifically for high-altitude warfare. Park's electronic warfare equipment detected a new type of transmission emanating from the creature's position. Unlike the complex communication patterns they had monitored from the smaller beings, this signal was simple, direct, and somehow familiar. The frequency matched emergency aviation channels used by military aircraft, but the modulation was wrong. It was as if something was attempting to communicate using their own protocols but lacked complete understanding of how the systems actually functioned. The transmission that came through their headsets was clear despite all the interference they had been experiencing. The voice was deep, resonant, and spoke in accented but perfectly understandable English. American helicopter, you will land now. Your weapons cannot function in this place. Your machines fail because this is old territory. You do not belong in the high places where the snow people keep watch. Santos exchanged glances with her crew. The tactical situation had just shifted from electronic warfare to direct communication with an unknown entity that possessed both English language skills and detailed knowledge of their aircraft's vulnerabilities. The voice continued, "We have watched your metal birds cross our boundaries for many seasons. Always you come with instruments that see in darkness. Always you seek what is not meant for your kind to find." Chen reported that his thermal imaging was now detecting dozens of heat signatures surrounding their position on multiple ridge lines. The creatures had established what military doctrine would classify as a perfect ambush formation, with overlapping fields of observation and movement routes that would prevent escape in any direction. More disturbing was the realization that these positions had been prepared in advance, with what appeared to be constructed shelters and equipment caches positioned at strategic intervals throughout the mountainous terrain. The massive entity's voice returned, carrying a tone that suggested authority developed through centuries of command experience. Your people make war in the low places, where the air is thick and the earth is warm. Here the rules are different. Here the old agreements still hold power. You will descend to the valley floor and speak with those who remember when your kind first learned to make tools from metal. Santos faced a decision that would either save her crew or doom them to become the subject of classified reports that would never see official acknowledgement. The fuel remaining in their tanks would support perhaps 10 more minutes of flight time, and their electronic systems were now so compromised that controlled flight was becoming impossible. Emergency landing procedures in mountainous terrain required functional instruments and adequate visibility, neither of which they currently possessed. The weather system that had been building throughout their reconnaissance mission was now producing whiteout conditions that made visual flight references impossible to maintain. Wind speeds were gusting above 50 knots, creating turbulence that their already stressed aircraft could barely handle. Ice was beginning to form on their rotor blades, reducing lift efficiency and increasing the power requirements needed to maintain altitude. Every pilot's nightmare was converging simultaneously in the thin air of the high Himalayas. Park made a tactical assessment that changed their entire approach to the situation. His analysis of the communication patterns suggested that the beings they were encountering possessed not just intelligence, but also cultural sophistication that included concepts of negotiation and diplomatic protocol. The entity that had spoken to them had used language that implied the existence of established territorial boundaries and historical agreements between different groups. This wasn't first contact with primitive creatures. It was an encounter with an organized society that had been observing human activities for extended periods. The crew's training had emphasized the importance of maintaining mission security, even under extreme circumstances, but their current situation fell outside any scenario covered in standard operating procedures. They were dealing with entities that combined physical capabilities beyond human norms with technology that could disrupt military-grade electronic systems and cultural knowledge that included diplomatic concepts and historical awareness spanning decades or potentially centuries. Santos made the decision to attempt controlled communication while beginning a careful descent toward the valley floor. The risks of emergency landing in hostile territory were now outweighed by the certainty that continued flight would result in uncontrolled impact with terrain. She keyed her radio transmitter and spoke clearly into her microphone, knowing that their communications were being monitored by entities whose capabilities remained largely unknown. This is United States military aircraft requesting safe passage through your territory. We were conducting routine reconnaissance and did not intend to violate any established boundaries. We require immediate assistance due to mechanical difficulties caused by extreme weather conditions. The response came within seconds, demonstrating communication capabilities that suggested sophisticated monitoring equipment and rapid decision-making processes. American pilot Santos, your aircraft carries instruments designed to reveal hidden places and weapons, designed to destroy what you cannot understand. These tools have no power where the old covenants still govern the high places. You will land where we direct, and your crew will speak with the council that remembers the first agreements. The fact that the entity knew Santos's name, despite their never having transmitted that information, suggested intelligence-gathering capabilities that extended far beyond their immediate encounter. Park's equipment detected multiple transmission sources throughout the valley system, indicating a communication network that covered significant geographic area and possessed the technical sophistication to intercept and decode military radio traffic in real time. Chen's thermal imaging revealed that the creatures were now moving information toward a specific location on the valley floor, where the heat signatures suggested some form of prepared landing area. The beings moved with military precision, maintaining intervals and coordination that indicated extensive training in tactical operations. Their movement patterns showed none of the randomness associated with wildlife behavior, and all of the characteristics of organized military units responding to a planned scenario. As Santos began her approach toward the designated landing coordinates, she realized that their aircraft was being guided by some form of external navigation assistance that was more precise than their own GPS systems had been even before the electronic warfare had begun. The helicopter's flight path was being subtly adjusted by forces she couldn't identify, correcting for wind conditions and terrain obstacles with accuracy that suggested real-time monitoring of their aircraft's performance parameters. The landing area that appeared through the swirling snow was clearly artificial, constructed specifically to accommodate aircraft operations, despite being located at an altitude where such facilities should have been impossible to build and maintain. The surface was level and clear of obstacles, with what appeared to be approach lighting systems that became visible only as they descended below the cloud ceiling. Most remarkably, the area was generating enough heat to prevent ice accumulation, suggesting power sources and engineering capabilities that rivaled anything available to conventional military forces. Park detected massive electronic signatures emanating from underground installations that extended far beneath the valley floor. The transmission patterns indicated power generation and communication systems operating on scales that would require substantial infrastructure and technical expertise to construct and maintain. Whatever they were encountering in this remote Himalayan location was not a primitive society that had accidentally acquired advanced technology, but rather an established civilization that had deliberately chosen isolation while maintaining capabilities that matched or exceeded modern military standards. As their Black Hawk touched down on the prepared landing surface, the crew could see through their thermal imaging that they were surrounded by beings whose heat signatures suggested metabolic processes adapted for extreme cold conditions. The entities maintained respectful distances, but positioned themselves in patterns that clearly communicated their ability to prevent any unauthorized departure. This was not a rescue operation. It was a formal reception conducted according to protocols that suggested diplomatic experience spanning generations. Chen observed that the massive entity whose voice they had been hearing was now approaching their aircraft, with a delegation of smaller beings whose movements suggested ceremonial or official functions rather than military postures. The group advanced with the measured pace of diplomats conducting formal introductions rather than captors approaching prisoners. Their body language conveyed authority and confidence, but also curiosity about the human crew they were about to meet face to face. Santos shut down their aircraft's engines according to standard procedures, while maintaining awareness that they were now completely dependent on the goodwill of beings whose intentions remained unknown despite their apparently diplomatic approach. The crew's survival equipment included cold weather gear, rated for extreme conditions, but they were about to venture into an environment where the ambient temperature could prove lethal within minutes if their hosts proved hostile or simply withdrew their protection. The moment had arrived when 4 elite military operators would step out of their familiar technological environment and enter direct contact with entities that challenged every assumption about what was possible in the modern world. Their training had prepared them for combat against human adversaries using conventional weapons and tactics, but nothing in their experience had equipped them for negotiating with beings whose capabilities spanned both primitive appearance and sophisticated technological application. As Santos opened the crew door and felt the brutal cold of the high-altitude air strike her exposed skin, she realized that their reconnaissance mission had transformed into something that would either expand human understanding of the world or become another classified file that would disappear into the deepest levels of military secrecy. The choice was no longer theirs to make. The massive figure that approached their downed aircraft moved with a grace that seemed impossible for something of its enormous proportions. Through the swirling snow and limited visibility, Chen could make out details that his thermal imaging had only hinted at during their aerial reconnaissance. The creature stood nearly 15 feet tall, covered in thick white and grey fur that provided perfect camouflage against the mountainous terrain. Its face, while unmistakably humanoid, possessed features that suggested evolutionary adaptation to extreme altitude environments. The eyes were larger than human proportions would indicate, with pupils that dilated and contracted rapidly as they adjusted to different light conditions. What struck Santos most profoundly was the intelligence evident in those eyes. This wasn't the vacant stare of an animal responding to instinct, but rather the calculated assessment of a being that was evaluating them according to criteria they couldn't begin to understand. The creature's breathing produced visible vapor clouds in the frigid air, but its respiratory rate remained steady despite the thin oxygen levels that had their own crew struggling even with supplemental systems. The entity spoke again, and this time the crew could hear the natural resonance of its voice without electronic interference. The vocal cords that produced those sounds were clearly adapted for long-distance communication across mountain valleys. Yet the being had somehow learned to modulate its speech for close-range conversation with smaller beings. The accent was unlike anything Park had encountered during his linguistic training, combining elements that suggested exposure to multiple human language families over extended periods. "I am Thanka, keeper of the high passes and guardian of the ancient boundaries. Your metal bird carries the scent of many lands, and your crew speaks the tongue of those who came before seeking the same forbidden knowledge." The creature gestured toward their helicopter with movements that demonstrated surprising dexterity, despite hands that were easily twice the size of human equivalents. "We have watched your people's flying machines for many seasons, always searching, always disturbing the places where silence should reign." Chen noticed that several smaller beings had positioned themselves around their aircraft, examining the exterior surfaces with what appeared to be scientific curiosity rather than hostile intent. Their inspection techniques were methodical and systematic, focusing on the sensor arrays and communication equipment that had been compromised during their approach to the valley. One of the creatures was manipulating a device that looked like carved stone, but generated electromagnetic signatures that Park's equipment could detect, despite its organic appearance. The technological paradox was becoming increasingly apparent. These beings possessed capabilities that could disrupt sophisticated military electronics, yet their tools and equipment appeared to be crafted from natural materials, using techniques that predated industrial civilization. The contradiction suggested either a deliberate choice to maintain primitive appearances while using advanced technology, or an understanding of physical principles that achieved technological results through entirely different methodological approaches. Thanka continued his assessment of the crew, his massive head tilting as he examined each team member with obvious intelligence. The female pilot carries the confidence of one who has faced the mountain storms and survived. The male who watches through heated glass possesses the patience of a hunter who waits for the perfect moment. The one who listens to the voices that travel through air knows more languages than his training has taught him. His gaze settled on Santos with particular intensity. "But you, leader of this metal bird, carry something else. The weight of decisions that determine whether your people live or die." The accuracy of Thankar's observations suggested an understanding of human psychology that went far beyond casual contact. This being had studied their species with the thoroughness of an anthropologist, learning to read body language, equipment functions, and behavioral patterns with precision that indicated extensive previous interaction with military personnel. The implications for operational security were staggering if these entities had been monitoring human activities in the region for the extended periods that Thankar's comments suggested. Santos found herself responding with the diplomatic protocols she had learned during officer training, though nothing in those courses had covered negotiation with 15-foot-tall humanoids in sub-zero mountain conditions. "I am Chief Warrant Officer Santos, and this is my crew. We were conducting routine reconnaissance when our equipment began malfunctioning. We appreciate your assistance and hope we can resolve this situation without conflict." The massive being made a sound that might have been laughter, though the deep resonance made it difficult to interpret emotional context. "Routine reconnaissance. Your people always use such careful words when you mean something different. You seek the source of the voices that speak in tongues your machines cannot understand. You search for the reason why your instruments fail when they approach places where the old knowledge still functions." The Nightstalkers never officially reported what transpired during their 8 hours on the valley floor with beings that military doctrine insists cannot exist. Their aircraft was found 3 days later at a forward operating base, fully refueled and mechanically sound, with no explanation for how it had traveled over 400 kilometers without crew operation. The mission logs contained only routine reconnaissance entries, and the crew maintained their silence despite intensive debriefing sessions that lasted for weeks. Chen retired from military service 6 months after Operation Glacier Crown, citing family obligations that intelligence officers noted coincided perfectly with the birth of his first child, though medical records showed no previous pregnancy in his wife's history. Santos continued flying for another decade, but never again accepted assignments involving high-altitude reconnaissance in disputed territories. Park transferred to electronic warfare research, where he spent the remainder of his career developing countermeasures for interference patterns that officially had never been encountered. Thanka's final words to the crew, recorded only in classified psychological evaluations that remain sealed, reportedly contained a warning about humanity's expansion into regions where ancient agreements still held authority. The entity had spoken of boundaries that existed not on maps, but in the understanding between species that had shared the planet far longer than human civilization had existed. Some territories, he had explained, were meant to remain hidden, not because they were dangerous, but because they were necessary. The Himalayan valleys where Operation Glacier Crown took place were subsequently designated as environmentally protected zones, officially to preserve endangered wildlife habitats. Satellite monitoring of the region continues, though the images are classified at levels that restrict access to fewer than a dozen individuals worldwide. Military aircraft are now prohibited from conducting operations within 50 kilometers of the coordinates where the Nightstalkers made their emergency landing, a restriction that has never been officially explained or challenged. In the decades since their encounter, all 4 crew members have maintained their silence about what they experienced in that remote valley. They have declined interviews, book deals, and documentary participation despite significant financial incentives. When pressed by investigators about their reluctance to discuss the mission, each has provided the same response with minor variations in wording, but identical underlying meaning. Some agreements, they explain, transcend military orders and national security classifications. Some promises are made not to human authorities, but to powers that existed long before governments learned to classify information and bury inconvenient truths. The Nightstalkers who encountered the Guardians of the High Passes understand that their silence protects not just classified operations or diplomatic relationships, but something far more fundamental to the balance that keeps humanity's expansion within acceptable boundaries. Whether these accounts represent genuine contact with unknown species, or simply the psychological effects of extreme conditions on elite operators, may never be definitively determined. What remains certain is that in the highest peaks where human presence becomes increasingly tenuous, the boundaries between the known and unknown become dangerously thin. Remember that some silences are maintained not because the truth is too dangerous to reveal, but because it is too important to disturb.